Right, okay, hi there guys. It's Mrs. Marshall, Miss Harrison and Miss Wan, and we're going to be talking about the beginning of Act 1 after the stage directions. So we spoke about the stage directions in our first lesson, and we're moving on to hearing a bit more about Mr. Birling and what he's like. So I'm just going to get the slides up now, and we're going to get started. So let's just recap, and I'm going to just put Mrs. Marshall and Miss Harrison out off video. So let's just get started then. So what's happened so far, and what should you have read up to? Okay, so we know that the Birlings are going to be celebrating the engagement of Sheila and Gerald in this opening. We find out that Mr. Birling seems delighted with this union, as he hopes it will unite his manufacturing business with Gerald's family's company, Crofts Limited, and we're going to find out why he loves it so much. He's clearly presented as capitalist, and he's quite dismissive, in particular, the impact of the work strikes and the threat of war. So we're going to go through some key quotes, and I'm going to start you off before we hear Mrs. Marshall and Miss Harrison. So the key quotes to focus on. So just a reminder, you're going to be sent a key quote sheet as well, so which will help you annotate as you listen. So first thing I want to talk about is the fact that I talked about the idea that Sheila and Gerald are engaged. So the whole point of this celebration is the idea that they're celebrating the engagement. So the first thing that I want to point out is that Mr. Birling, when he hears about the engagement, he makes the marital union sound like a business transaction. He's really pleased about the idea that Sheila is marrying up, because as we said in the last lesson, I believe, that Gerald is of the upper class. And so this will allow Mr. Birling to navigate himself up the social ladder, initially through his own marriage, because we know that Mrs. Birling is his social superior, and now Sheila's. And this can show that he's quite a selfish being. He doesn't really talk about the qualities that Gerald has as a person when he finds out they're engaged. It's more about this idea that he likes the idea of the status that he's going to bring to their family. So when we look at this quote, and perhaps we may look forward to the time when Crofts and Birlings are no longer competing, but are working together for lower costs and higher prices. This idea that when we zoom in on the idea of lower costs and higher prices, he's talking about it in the sense of a monetary sense. He thinks that he's going to get more money from profiting by bringing these two companies together. But actually, when we look at the connotations of costs, it's actually a little bit more ambiguous than that, because what Priestley's talking about here is that the cost of his indulgent lifestyle, because we know from the setting and the stage directions that they are a wealthy family, that the cost of that is actually the exploitation of the working class, of people who work in his factories, particularly when we're looking at this idea of there not being a minimum wage in 1912. So the factory owners were free to pay the workers what they wish. And so this is one thing I think Priestley wants to highlight when we look at the idea of lower costs and higher prices. The idea of the price of the fact that he, sorry, I lost my train of thought there. There's the idea that he's got the price, is the idea that millions were left impoverished. So when we look at the connotations of price, you know, the fact that Mr. Birling talks about it in a monetary sense shows you that he sort of neglects the idea of everybody else that is exploiting, so that he can benefit from that. I don't know if there's anything else that Miss Harrison or Miss Marshall want to add to this quote.
Yeah, I completely agree with everything you've said, zooming in on those important words. I think it might be just worth a reminder as well, just all the way through the play to note the memory of the fact that the play is written in 1945. So all of this, all of the things that Miss Wan's just talked about, the audience in 1945 would have been gifted with hindsight to know what comes later. So that's quite an important thing to remember all the way through, because later in this scene, before the inspector comes in, there's a few times where Eric tries to put some much more modern points of view forward, points of view that many of the audience would be feeling would warrant explanation and would deserve talking about, you know, such as him saying, why shouldn't they try for higher prices and things like that. Wages, sorry, why shouldn't they try for higher wages? We try for the highest possible prices. So there's several times where Eric sounds like the voice of reason to the audience because of the hindsight, but he's dismissed very much by Birling as sort of interfering, silly little kid, as he tries to suck up to Gerald. So might just be worth a reminder of that. It makes everything that you've said about him seem even worse to that audience.
Yeah, I think it's quite sort of interesting about the phrasing of working together, which gives this imagery of a sort of working as a community, but he's only interested if it's for his own self-interest, because he only wants to work alongside the Crofts, because, like I said, it's this idea of him going up that social, his obsession with sort of increasing his status in society. I'm just going to move on to another key quote that we can talk about, linking to how Mr. Birling chooses to describe himself, and he repeats this phrase several times across the opening of Act 1 before the inspector arrives. And I think it's quite interesting that he talks about this, describing himself as a hard-headed, practical man of business. And I say there isn't a chance of war. And again, we said in the earlier presentations, when we looked at the opening stage directions, that we want to see the Birlings as unlikable. And I think this adjective, hard-headed, is one way of doing that, because it shows you that, when we think about the connotations of this adjective, that he's quite inflexible, and in terms of his viewpoints, this could suggest that he's quite inflexible in changing his outlook. And I think that could foreshadow how he sort of will interact with the inspector when the inspector comes into the play in this act. He doesn't really want to listen to what the inspector has to say in terms of how he's responsible for the death of Eva Smith. I guess another thing we could look at, the idea of hard-headed, practical man of business, is that actually when Priestley uses this adjective, it highlights the rigid Edwardian values which Mr. Birling holds. And actually, the fact that they are so rigid is why there's such a sort of inflexible class system in place, which helps the rich benefit, but then there's no chance of the working class sort of bettering themselves. And actually, I think by doing that, Priestley highlights that this is what is actually hindering the progress of society, that there are people out there that don't wish to transform their attitudes. I don't know if anybody wants to add to that.
No. We're right behind you.
Yeah. And Miss Wan.
Okay, brilliant. Okay, so Mrs. Marshall's going to take over now, and she's going to talk about the quote underneath.
Wonderful. So we talked a little bit about Mr. Birling's inflexibility and his arrogance, and this next quote is a really good one. It's an easy one to remember, and it's one that you can really say a lot about. So as we discussed before, the timing of the setting of the play is vitally important, and he's very specific about it being the spring of 1912 when the play takes place. So it might only be sort of 10 days, a couple of weeks before the Titanic sinks. And this would have been something that the audience perhaps would have held in living memory, so it would certainly be something that they would know in terms of the importance of the date. And so it's really important when in one of his speeches, Mr Birling arrogantly declares that the Titanic, this new luxury liner that's about to set sail, has been declared as absolutely unsinkable. He repeats it twice, so the use of repetition to kind of emphasise this idea that he feels that there's nothing that can bring this ship down, which it creates humour for the audience for a start. This section of the play, some of the things he says, they start to become a bit satirical, because obviously, and any performances that you see of it, I don't know if you've found it as well, but people do often give a little laugh in the audience because they just like to laugh at how arrogant he is at this point. So it definitely serves to make him appear very foolish, which is a very deliberate act by Priestley. He wants us to think that he's foolish. But it's much more clever than that. It's not just about Mr Birling appearing as foolish, so therefore we're less likely to sympathise with his views, his capitalist views, we're more likely to turn against him. But it's also about crediting the audience with the intelligence, the feeling that you know more, and that therefore you are therefore going to be given this sort of greater power in the play to maybe understand things on a deeper level, which is exactly what he wants. And it's very clever if you think about the way that persuasion works. And this is, he's got a political agenda here, making your audience feel clever and feel in on something that the characters don't. Is going to empower that message. It's going to make you perhaps want to side with him more and side with the inspector when he later enters. More than that, though, the actual fact that he's picked the Titanic as the historical event that he wants Mr Birling to focus on is important as well, because you could look at it as symbolic, as a metaphor. The Titanic was a representation of the British manufacturing industry. It was supposed to represent the greatest of luxury, and famously had the very different sections on the ship for the different classes. So it was almost like a sort of a floating microcosm of society in a way, the way that the classes were treated on board. And then that is then reflected in what happens when the disaster strikes. There weren't enough, again, the audience at the time would have known a lot about the investigations that took place after the sinking of the Titanic, where it was revealed that there weren't enough lifeboats on board for all of the passengers. And it was believed that lifeboats were removed to preserve the aesthetics of the boat, which is important. They cared a lot about how the boat appeared. And this would be a lovely point that you could make that would fit in with the upper class attitudes in the play, the idea that appearances are more important than reality, and that is carried through in many of the themes of the play, and indeed the way that often the family care a lot more about how they're viewed rather than the truth. So the fact that the lifeboats were removed from the aesthetics, that could be an interesting point to play on, because then that jeopardised the safety of all the passengers, but mostly the working class, the third class passengers that were on the lowest part of the deck. So this could link back to what Miss Wan said earlier about the idea of the cost, the irony there that he thinks about keeping costs down, but actually by doing that, the human cost to the working classes goes up. Like Miss Wan said, you've got a similar kind of metaphor here, where it's again, the boat was preserved for aesthetics, less lifeboats, but then it's the third class passengers that lost out. I think it like 62% of passengers in the first class section of the boat survived, whereas only 25% of the third class passengers survived, because the upper classes were prioritised. So you could look at this as a bit of a metaphor for society, and also the arrogance of the British manufacturing industry to think that they could create something that was unsinkable, as well. So there's lots of different things that you could say about that reference to the Titanic, and as well as this idea that the spring of 1912 perhaps has connotations of the need for change, the need for new life, something to be different, and for this kind of idea needs to sink and something else needs to spring forward, i.e. a more socialist way of thinking. Would anyone else like to jump in here on that one?
Again, I think you've nailed it.
Yeah, I've got something to put forward just to see if this is. I mean, that was a brilliant interpretation. Very exploratory, Mrs. Marshall. I mean, in terms of when we teach this, do you think you could also look at the idea of the Titanic foreshadowing the magnitude of the downfall of the Birlings as well, or is that too far of a stretch in your guys?
Oh no, definitely, definitely. Because then, absolutely. I mean, yeah, I think that's exactly what it is. It's the way that we're encouraged to laugh at him in that way. It's almost as though he thinks he's unsinkable, isn't it? I'm unsinkable, I'm untouchable. And the words almost, the fact that they're quite similar words, we're untouchable. The way that he kind of, when the policeman arrives, he sort of drops in the golf references. They're used to living this easy life where they think that they can just throw a bit of money at a situation and it'll be resolved. And the horror of the evening shows them potentially that they're not untouchable. Yeah, definitely.
Excellent. So we're going to move on to the fourth quote we've got here, which Miss Harrison's going to be discussing now.
Okay, everyone. So this is Mr. Birling's kind of first jab at socialists. He makes several reference to them being cranks and kind of insults like that throughout the play. We're going to be focusing on this bit in green, as you can see on your screen, as if we're all mixed up together like bees in a hive, community and all that nonsense. So there's a really strong socialist message here within the words used in this quote, that Birling really criticises and he opposes those views, him being a capitalist. If we kind of zoom in on more individual words and look at the simile to begin with, mixed up together like bees in a hive. So Mr. Birling is for class segregation. He doesn't want to be seen to be mixing with people who are at the lower class than he is. There's kind of irony in that he mixes with him as a kind of lower class to his wife. She is mixing with him when they get married, but he doesn't see a problem in that. His whole hatred is towards the working class people like Eva Smith, which is why he shows such little sympathy towards her throughout the play. In particular, then, this noun bees can be seen as a metaphor for the workers in his factory and working class people generally. Bees are kind of known for working together to produce something, in normal cases honey. So it's this idea of the bees being a metaphor for workers and kind of socialist ideas. Again, the irony here is that the play was set in 1912, where it was a much more capitalist society, but it would have been played to a 1945 audience, as we've already said. So the idea of working together and coming together as a community, that would have been the norm for people in 1945, his 1945 audience. They would have been used to a much more fluid class system where there wasn't such rigid rules in place for, working class people can only achieve this and blah, blah, blah. So again, his views on socialism and anything that isn't for himself seem very foolish and very stupid to the 1945 audience, very out of touch, old-fashioned. So yeah. And then we come on to this idea of community and all that nonsense. Now, obviously, when you look at the idea of something being nonsense, it means, stupid, nonsensical, it doesn't make sense. But something that I like to do with my students is looking at the actual like dictionary definition of something and seeing whether you can eke meaning out of that. So an actual definition for the word nonsense means that words that have no meaning or make no sense. Now, to Mr Birling, the idea of community has no meaning to him. It doesn't serve him. It doesn't serve his purpose. He, as I've already said, wants to be segregated from, you know, these working class people. He sees himself as being above them. Another definition for nonsense means foolish behaviour. So he believes that to work as a community and work together is foolish behaviour. Again, the irony in that is that Priestley, all the way through the play, through the words that he's putting into Mr Birling's mouth, is making him seem foolish to the audience. And I think that's a really important and clever thing that Priestley does that you can note. Another thing that you could comment on is looking at syntax. This isn't a necessary thing, but it's more about getting as much out of a quote as you can. Now, syntax is looking at the order of words to create meaning. Okay, so we've got a lot of kind of socialist words within this quote, and then we end the quote with nonsense. So the final thing that in this quotation that Mr Birling is focused on is that all these words that he's said previously to this, that have preceded this word, are stupid. He believes in his mind that working together is bad for business, really. He doesn't see it as a kind of necessary and successful, almost like a business thing. He doesn't see it as good for him. So yeah, has anyone else got anything to add to that?
Fabulous. No, I think that's wonderful. I think it might just be worth noting the structure of the play there, because it's such an important quote, but the timing of it is really important as well, because just as Mr Birling is declaring that community is nonsense, just at the end of this speech that you can see on your screen here, you can see that it's cut off here. We've got the epicia pieces at the end here of his own, and you've got little dashes there. That means that he wants the actor to be cut off deliberately. And hopefully you can remember from last time you did it, he's cut off very specifically by a sharp ring at the doorbell, which is the inspector's entrance. So the structure of that's really important. The fact that he's deliberately timed that speech just before the inspector enters, interrupts Mr Birling. And again, it comes back to crediting the audience with this higher intelligence, the benefit of hindsight. The audience that Miss Harrison's just talked about, that have been through the war, that have come together and acted as a community. This is the audience that was supposed to vote for Churchill. He was the Conservative candidate after the war, but actually it was a landslide victory for Labour, which was a much more socialist party. Clement Attlee won. So that audience there are already more socialist in their views, and so therefore they would sympathise with him being cut off, and there's an opportunity to zoom in on that word sharp, almost though it's like an alarming wake-up call for society, that the writer is using his voice there to sort of suggest that Mr Birling needs to be silenced, and needs to be cut off before they can go any further. That's it.
I mean, this is really good interpretations, Miss Marshall and Miss Harrison. I'm just wondering, I was just looking as I was listening to Miss Harrison, you know, the noun youngsters. I think the fact that Mr Birling says it is quite worrying, isn't it? Because the youngsters are Eric and Sheila, and I guess Gerald you could count, and they're quite impressionable. And when we talked about Sheila being sheltered in our first presentation, is it quite worrying that the only experience they've got is from Mr Birling? Because when we juxtapose that with and I've learned in the good hard school of experience, is his experience quite narrow? Because again, if we're thinking about this idea of them being quite insular in the dining room and sort of shut themselves off from society. The only opinions they've got is this man that's just full of, like we said, nonsense. He's foolish and he's massively incorrect about everything.
Yeah, and that's the thing, I think, as well, like Mrs. Marshall has just said. I think that's why this speech is so important in terms of its timing, because otherwise Mr. Birling would just be able to, you know, if the inspector wasn't to come, and they would be influenced by all of this you know, capitalist rant that Mr. Birling's going on, and that's what they would have to kind of look up to, I guess. It's up when you know the inspector comes in and is able to influence Eric and Sheila as younger characters, that they are able to move their characters and develop their characters forward into a more socialist way of thinking.
Yeah, he kind of empowers them. So the word youngsters, the kind of connotation of that, isn't it, that kind of triviality, the way, the patronizing kind of way. You could then contrast that if you were writing an essay about, you know, the difference between the older and younger generations. You could then contrast that with some evidence from the end to show that how they've been empowered by the inspector, and to do what the play really wants to do, which is to kind of highlight the dangers of falling back into this kind of past way of thinking, I suppose, and to try and make people leave the theatre with the younger generation representing a sense of hope, rather than being trivial youngsters not to be listened to.
Well, I just feel like I've learned a lot during this session, so I hope anybody that's listening has as well. And I'm going to leave us there for today, because the next time you're going to hear from us all is when we are going to be looking at when the inspector arrives, and you know, we're going to see how Mr. Birling reacts to how he is held responsible for the death of Eva Smith. So we're all going to go now. Bye.
Bye.
Bye.